welcome to Faversham Town Council's Introducing 20 Miles an Hour to Faversham webinar. I'm Councillor Eddie Thomas and I'll be chairing this webinar. And we have three presenters with us today, and each will be making their own presentation. We've got Amanda Russell, who's the founder of 20's Plenty for Faversham. Phil Jones, who's the designer of the scheme and who has a lot of experience in designing 20 mile an hour schemes. And Jamie Watson, who's the senior KCC Highways scheme manager. After each of these presentations, we'll have a question and answer session. And I would ask, please, can you use the Q&A button to submit your questions? And you can do that at any time during the presentations, and I'll pick up on that once the presentations have finished. Okay, I'm going to firstly introduce and invite Amanda to present her presentation. Thank you, Amanda.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Right, is that okay? Is that working? Can everybody see that?
Yes.
And is it very clear?
Yeah, very clear, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm Amanda Russell and I'm going to talk about why 20's Plenty for Faversham started and the development of the campaign and scheme over the past 5 years. Okay, the Faversham campaign began in 2015 after 2 fatal accidents on crossings and a hit and run involving a school child. It felt as though there was an unhealthy balance on our streets between motorists, pedestrians and cyclists, and we wanted to find a way to put that right. A group of residents supported by our local Green Party launched a 20's Plenty campaign and ran a petition online and offline at 3 locations in town. And in just a few weeks, we had collected about 500 signatures. We also posted a survey on Street Life, which was what Nextdoor was called when it first launched. And we asked people if they'd support 20 mile an hour limits on their streets. And on that survey, we got an 82% yes response rate, which made us think that we were onto something and that we should keep going. I took the petition to the town council and gave a presentation on the benefits of 20 mile per hour limits. This gained their unanimous support and they advised us to approach Kent County Council. Sorry. We wrote to Matthew Balfour, KCC's cabinet member for transport at the time, and he said that he couldn't lead or fund a 20 mile an hour scheme here on the grounds that it was too expensive, our residents were too fit and well, and there hadn't been enough casualties, and it wouldn't qualify under that criteria. We thought that this needed to be examined in more detail, so we looked at those statistics ourselves. And this is Crash Map, and you can look at these statistics yourself at crashmap.co.uk. So these are statistics that anybody can go and look at crashmap.co.uk. So back then, according to Crash Map, there had been 140 incidents in 5 years, and we discovered that the 2 fatalities that we were aware of hadn't been included in those figures because they occurred later in hospital and not at the roadside. We also found out that the cost of administering to a slight accident is £23,000. And as awful as it is to put a price on these things, we thought that anything that could be done to reduce those accidents would have the added benefit of saving money that could be spent elsewhere. And here you can see the obesity levels for Year 6 children in Swale. In one Faversham ward, St Anne's, they are amongst the highest in the country, with adjacent Priory ward scoring just below that. So we could see that the public health indicators were actually very high, with 4 wards across Faversham achieving an average score of 108, placing us in the top 3rd west of Kent's rankings. Kent's own joint health and wellbeing strategy told us that Kent is performing worse than the national average in obesity in adults, and the Swale District Health Profile showed the same. This is a pedestrian crossing on the A2, also known as Osprey Street or Watling Road. Children from the local primary and secondary schools cross here every day, twice a day, with lorries passing close by, and it's right in the middle of an air quality monitoring area where many residents also live. All are being exposed to levels of pollution that represent a significant health hazard. So we decided to present this evidence to Swales Joint Transportation Board and demonstrate how a 20-mile-an-hour limit could help. We had the full support of our town council to do this, and this was the Sheil Campbell was the mayor at the time, and this was the letter that the town council sent in support at that time. To our relief, they tasked Faversham Town Council to set up a working group to examine how to implement a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit in Faversham. And this is Councillor Mike Whiting, who was chair of the Joint Transportation Board at the time. He also asked that a nominee from the community, from the campaign, be included on the working party. This working group went on for 4 years to develop the scheme and gather more support. And it ultimately comprised of elected councillors and community campaigners working together hand in hand. We also took the advice of 20's Plenty for Us, the national campaigning organisation, and with the help of 20's Plenty for Kent's Adrian Berent, we looked at where Kent's policy on setting speed limits differed from the DfT's policy, and we found that the former were setting criteria that were restricting the implementation of these limits. And there isn't a casualty rate that you have to reach in order to qualify, nor is there an obesity quota. So we decided to take a different approach, and we reached out to the community again. We engaged more residents in more depth, and on a stall in our market square at Faversham's Transport Weekend in 2016, we invited people to place red dots on a town map to indicate places where traffic made them feel unsafe to walk or cycle. We wanted to see how the speed and volume of traffic was affecting people's lives and journeys about town more generally, and whether it was impinging on their general mobility. The map was also posted on our official Facebook page, where many more residents continued to comment. So this provided us with valuable community engagement, and we found that residents were keen to talk about their experiences, as well as learn about the benefits of 20 miles per hour on their streets. And it opened up a two-way flow of communication. We learned about the places they try and avoid walking and crossing because they feel unsafe. And as you can see from the map, they are sort of all over the place. There are lots of different locations. We did consider whether we should go down the route of campaigning for various crossings, but when we looked at how many crossings we would need to put in to have the same sort of impact that a wide area 20-mile-an-hour limit would have, it seemed that this was the more sensible, more achievable, more affordable option that would have the greatest benefit for the greatest number of residents. We are extremely fortunate. When we compared the protest map with crash map, we could also see that accidents were occurring in the places where residents were most fearful. So that told us that people are accurate in their perception of danger on their own streets, which is what you would expect, really. We are extremely fortunate to have the expert help of Tim Stoner, who is a highly respected urban planner, but who also campaigns with us as a local resident. And it was Tim who recommended that in order to move forward, we look at examples of best practice elsewhere in the country and across the world. And this brought us to the work of independent transport advisor Phil Jones of Phil Jones Associates. And the Town Council agreed to fund Phil Jones Associates to undertake a feasibility study for a 20-mile-an-hour zone on all residential streets in Faversham. So this appraisal gave principles and recommendations which we put to Swales Joint Transportation Board later that year. And to our great relief, in December 2016, they voted unanimously to accept all of them. The key recommendation was for the limit to be town-wide, because it was understood that would achieve the greatest benefit for the greatest number of residents, was easier to promote, easier to sign, and it more easily understood, so we would gain better compliance. At that meeting, the board also proposed an amendment for a borough-wide limit across residential streets in Swale. Okay, since then, we've continued to build on our support base across the town, the borough and the political spectrum. And here you can see some of our supporters from various political parties. These are all local councillors, as well as our county councillor. And we've had local councillors who have stood for election on the promise of supporting and implementing a 20-mile-an-hour limit. And our MP has also consistently pledged her support. And we're also supported by organisations such as the Faversham Society, the Gunpowder Women's Institute, Swale Friends of the Earth, Abbey Residents Association, our GP Surgery in Newton Road, and our own town and borough councils with their new administrations. We've continued to carry out various types of community engagement. Some of it has been to go support, and this was an Abbey Residents Association meeting where we asked for a show of hands in support of the townwide limit. And on the right is an informal poll we took at the Faversham Transport Weekend last year in 2019. And some of it has been to raise awareness, to distribute posters and leaflets and encourage compliance and long-term behaviour change. And some of it has also been to share information with residents and gather their feedback to inform the scheme's design further. And at Faversham's annual Transport Weekend, Phil Jones gave 5 presentations to different groups of residents with images demonstrating the innovative calming measures proposed. And we also displayed a large map showing those interventions and gathered resident feedback, which Phil Jones then incorporated into the next stage of design. And this is the technical map, which was showcased to residents for the first time at this event, and ahead of the scheme being formalised. And this was in order to gauge residents' feedback and their level of support. And it was also featured in the local press and on our Facebook page and the Town Council's website. And then on May 10th, 2019, KCC approved all of the technical recommendations put forward by the Phil Jones Associates, and in support of the 20-mile-an-hour scheme here in Faversham. And later that month, KCC published their revised 20-mile-an-hour policy, which directly recognised 2 key elements of Faversham's scheme: the use of more innovative and less intrusive traffic calming measures on higher speed streets, and the importance of community demand over casualty rates and deprivation statistics. So us going back and looking at those statistics was useful, but it was also, we also were able to make the case, and it was taken on board, that community demand is a really important part of this, and it's not just about counting casualties, it's about how it's affecting people's quality of life. Although we know more needs to be done, these changes will make wide area 20-mile-per-hour limits where people live more achievable and more affordable, and we really welcome those policy changes. And the pressure is very much on. In 2019, the Faversham Society and the University of Kent embarked on a traffic pollution survey to more accurately measure pollution levels on the A2 and several other locations in Faversham. Led by Professor Chris Wright, also a Faversham resident, the study measured PM2.5 and PM10 particles and nitrogen dioxide, and significantly, it measured both at child height, which hadn't been done before, and that's really important because we have children, lots of children crossing at that point, and pollution is more concentrated lower down. The findings of that study have culminated in the Mid-Kent Environmental Health Group extending their traffic pollution monitoring to 4 more sites in Faversham. And you can read more about that study on the Faversham Society website at favershamsociety.org/traffic air quality. And in the wider context, housing development on 3 sides of the town is significantly increasing Faversham's population. And there is an urgent need for interconnectivity and travel that is not dominated by car use. The KCC policy changes had already made our scheme eligible for local transport plan funding. And in recognition of the role that 20-mile-per-hour limits play in increasing levels of walking and cycling, the scheme then qualified for DFT funding as part of the COVID-19 recovery plan to promote active travel. And so everything is suddenly happening and suddenly being brought forward at a much faster pace than it would have done otherwise. So KCC are now leading the scheme, and the DFT are funding the scheme. And we've seen the first phase of implementation begin this month with roundels and coloured signs appearing on our streets. And today is particularly significant as many of our school children return to school for the first time in 6 months, and they will be travelling along streets with 20-mile-per-hour signage. In order to continue the history of community engagement surrounding the scheme and drawing on best practice elsewhere, Tim Stoner advised the use of a digital community engagement platform to complement traditional methods of paper engagement and enable the Town Council to continue to have a two-way conversation with the community about the scheme. Last month, the Commonplace website was launched with the aim of keeping residents informed and also letting them have their say. And you can do that in great detail. And I encourage all residents to go to this website, which is at 20 miles per hour faversham.commonplace.is and have their say. KCC have also launched the formal consultation where you can register your approval and your objection to the scheme, and that will run until February 2021. And the idea is that we all see how this works and whether it's working and what the effect it's having on our streets. And then we can make an informed decision about whether this should become a permanent scheme. We think it's vitally important that Faversham Town Council and KCC continue to engage fully with the community throughout, as do they, throughout the implementation process and afterwards, so that this scheme really does achieve its goal of healthier, safer, cleaner streets for its residents. And that's all from me. So I'm just going to leave you with a few messages from some of our youngest supporters. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amanda. Shall I click onto my presentation now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. And yes, please, Phil, you can make a start, but thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you. I shall do that. There we go. Is that coming through okay?
All clear, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, so we've been involved in the scheme for a good few years now, working for the Town Council and supporting the 20s Plenty group, which we've been really pleased to do, and it's been a very interesting project to work on, quite groundbreaking. We actually think potentially this is the first time that a standalone town of this size has become entirely 20 miles per hour. So it is really quite groundbreaking stuff. So just to recap, essentially this is about the three objectives: reducing road casualties, improving air quality, and thereby reducing health inequalities, including obesity, by improving that air quality and getting more people to walk and cycle. Some of those changes will take more time, but I think we can expect to see speeds and casualties more quickly. And as Amanda said, the view that's been taken from the start, we endorse, is that a consistent town-wide limit is simpler and cheaper to sign and promote. It needs fewer signs every time the limit changes. And because it's more comprehensible, the whole town is clearly 20, it's more effective in changing driver attitudes and driver behaviour. So Faversham, obviously you all know it better than I do, but I think for me one of the interesting aspects of it is because it has the A2 to the south and very little development beyond that, presently at least, and to the west and east, and the river to the north, there's very little through traffic. So most traffic in Faversham has a local purpose, at least for one end of its journey. And therefore, a lot of traffic will be making quite short journeys. It'll be local people making those journeys. And to some extent, we may return to that. It's really the choice of people who live and work in Faversham, what speed they choose to drive at. And essentially, 20 miles per hour can be seen as a kind of enabler, a signal that is now viewed by society as the right thing to do. As Amanda said, the people were invited to indicate where they felt unsafe, and that's on the main road. So you can see that generally within the residential areas, with a few exceptions, most people feel generally safe there, and it's on those main through routes where they feel unsafe, and that's where we have to do something. And that's echoed, as we've said, in the data, in the actual data. So people do understand quite clearly where they feel unsafe, and that's accurate. And so what do we know about speed and road safety? Well, it's not a binary thing. I think we can't say that 30 miles per hour is unsafe and 20 miles per hour is unsafe. It's on a sliding scale. Anything that is done to reduce speeds, even by a relatively small amount, reduces collision frequency and actually the severity of those collisions. And this statistic, the 1 mile per hour reduction and reducing collision frequency by around 6%, that comes from the current Department for Transport guidance on setting speed limits, which was published in 2013, and that's clearly understood. So any speed reduction is beneficial. Then the other question is, are we aiming for a reduction, or are we aiming for compliance with 20 miles per hour? What the DFT guidance says is if speeds are already at or below 24, then we can expect average speeds to drop to around 20 if with just a speed limit. So that might lead you to think, well, above 24 miles per hour, 20 mile per hour limits on their own are not the right thing to do. However, the circular also says that, and referred back to some work that was done around that time, around 2012 in Portsmouth, that it's possible to introduce large-scale 20 mph limits in some built environments, and those citywide schemes contribute to changing travel and driving behaviour positively in the longer term. So this is about a behaviour change, signalling what we now regard as the right speed to be driving in these areas. So while it does talk about the 24 miles per hour limit, it does open the door to these wider area schemes. And so says implementation of those limits should be considered where mean speeds are at below 24 over a number of roads. It doesn't say all roads within that area, it just says a number of roads within those wider areas. And since then, there's been quite a few places since Portsmouth, London boroughs, Edinburgh, Bristol, that have found that by implementing these wide area limits, they do achieve a significant reduction in speeds. And I say, 2.7 miles per hour might strike you as a relatively small amount, but it is quite significant in terms of casualty reduction. And the largest reduction in speed was found to be on those A and B roads. And we can see that. So the apologies if this is perhaps a little bit technical, but this shows for 3 different types of road environment. It's taken from a research study that was done by the Department for Transport by the consultancy Atkins a couple of years ago. And the red line shows the percentage distribution of speeds for where the median speed was already below 20. And you can see that the before and after, which the before is the solid line, the after is the dotted line. If the speed was already at around 20, there's very little difference between the before and after speeds, and that's logical. If the speeds are already 20, then changing the speed limit to 20 miles per hour makes very little difference. But you can see that the grey lines, the roads where speeds were above 24, the difference is greater. So quite logically, the biggest impact that we get from changing speed limits is on the roads where speeds are higher, even if on those roads after the speed limit is introduced, we still have an average speed of above 20 miles per hour. That can be regarded as a success rather than necessarily a failure. So in the case of Faversham, Kent County Council had put down some speed tubes and found that, and these were targeted at the major roads coming in where speeds were generally expected to be a little bit higher. And it did find that in some of those cases, speeds were somewhere in the range of 24 to 30. So do we regard those as suitable for 20 miles per hour or not? Now, if we chose not to, then there would need to be a lot more signs to indicate every time you came off one of those radial routes into a residential area, you needed another pair of signs, so the scheme would cost more. And by missing out those roads, you would fail to calm the roads or reduce speeds on the roads where speeds are highest and where the benefit can be greatest. Now, we were fortunate, we were able to also obtain some other data, which is taken from GPS units in cars, and is published by Ordnance Survey. That actually found that speeds were a little bit lower than those KCC speeds, which perhaps were taken at some of the places where the traffic was flowing more freely. These are average speeds, so it's a little bit lower. But he still found that on some of the roads, like Bisingwood Road, Orr Road, speeds are above that 24 miles per hour threshold. However, we still felt and made the case successfully to Kent that there were benefits in including all of those roads within a town-wide limit, but with some modest changes to the road environment to help reduce speeds. So this is the scheme that Amanda's already quickly showed, was a diagrammatic representation of the recommendations, which I'll run through quickly what they all consist of. So gateways, some modest traffic calming on some of the streets, and on quite a few of the streets leading into the town centre, the simple change being the removal of some white line markings. And again, I'll just show you that. So just the gateways, fairly simple as you approach. So some of those would simply be signs, but in other places, some of the more important routes into the town, we think there's an opportunity there for some placemaking, maybe some planting, some signing to really announce to drivers and the general public that you are entering a town, and this is now you expect to drive a bit more slowly, and 20 miles per hour being the appropriate speed. And those changes to road markings on the major routes. So centerline removal, you can see that on some of these roads the centerline is there, but it actually has no practical function at all. It's simply not possible to drive one side or the other of the centerline, and that white line marking simply serves to emphasize the linearity of the route and actually is shown to increase driver speeds. So and you can see that TfL, Transport for London, have experimented in that. This is a section of the South Circular where, when they resurfaced the road a few years ago, they simply didn't put the white line back in the centre, and they found speed differences of between 2 to 4 miles per hour. So quite significant, and quite a few local authorities are now using this as a positive intervention to reduce speeds. And then we can supplement that with roundel markings, and this is one of the ones that's recently gone in to Faversham, which are very, very visible to drivers, and again clearly indicate the speed that is now in force. On Newton Road, we think there's an opportunity here. This is Newton Road is a very straight road. You can see the effect of the white line there. It's not surprising that speeds are quite high there. Parking is all on one side, and one of the interventions, or an intervention that we agree with KCC, was to simply swap some of that parking to the other side of the street. Now, this is not part of the current scheme. This is part of a future phase. We've done some designs for this, and it will need to be consulted on with local people to make sure they're happy with those changes. But we think that's a very low cost and practical way of helping to break up the linearity of that street. On Lower Road, we think there's an opportunity there. Again, speeds are a little bit higher, some fairly modest changes. We'd originally thought about doing build outs on the bus stops, so what are called bus stop borders, but when we've looked at it in more detail, a few issues around drainage and so on. So we're actually thinking here that we might just do some simple build outs at the junctions. Again, all this is just to show the current thoughts. All of this will need to be consulted on in more detail, but tightening up the corner radii, so as vehicles turn in and out of those side roads, they have to slow down more. All of that just to change the feeling of that environment. So these are relatively low cost changes, but obviously they're more than just white paint and signs. And then perhaps up on Orr Road, where we're away from properties, perhaps there some more conventional traffic calming. Again, could be in the form of simple speed cushions or something else. Again, all need to be consulted on, but those would go into support some of those roads where speeds are a little bit higher. But again, that's all part of a future phase. And then community corners, we think that this would also be tied to the enhanced gateways. Community corners is a term that was coined by Bristol City Council, where local communities come together to actually carry out relatively low cost schemes of planting and street furniture, and actually get involved in making physical changes to the streets themselves. We identified locations where it could enhance a historic walk route across Faversham and around school entrances. Again, this is all part of a future phase, but we think there's some quite exciting opportunities here for local people to get involved, to really make the change and to kind of buy into the fact that we're now expecting people to drive more slowly. So in terms of the phasing, all of that will ultimately happen subject to funding and subject to this current phase. So Jamie will explain a bit more detail, but phase 1 is now just the town-wide 20 limits signs and gateways, just some local centre line removal at those gateway points. So with the funding from DFT to make those changes quite quickly. Then if that experimental scheme is made permanent and subject to the feedback and monitoring that comes from it, phase 2, the physical traffic calming, that area-wide centre line removal, and then phase 3, the community corners, the enhanced gateways with local residents getting involved in that. So just to recap, we think that with this scheme, most streets will achieve compliance with the 20 limit because the speeds are already quite low. Some streets may require further traffic calming to achieve that compliance, but we still expect a worthwhile speed reduction even without that. So in summary, the proposed approach is to tolerate some non-compliance with 20 on a few streets in return for a more effective comprehensive scheme, and which is easy to sign and promote. We're putting in mainly low-cost interventions and then ultimately with local people's involvement. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Phil. Okay, we're going to move on to Jamie from Kent County Council, the Senior Highways Manager for implementing this scheme. Thank you, Jamie.
Hi there. Yes, my name's Jamie, work for KCC, and my task is to implement this scheme after the decisions have been made at the Joint Transportation Boards. I'm going to just talk about the project implementation, timing, funding, and what is going in where. So I will probably go over some that Amanda and Phil have already talked about, so I'll make it brief where I'm duplicating. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of the history first. We were initially planning to undertake these works through a traffic regulation order, a permanent one, which is a legal order required to allow the enforcement of a new or a speed limit. And the permanent traffic order would have required a consultation first, and then we get the feedback from the consultation and then make a recommendation to the Swale Joint Transportation Board, and they make a recommendation ultimately to the KCC Highways Cabinet member, which at the moment is Michael Payne. So he would make the ultimate decision on whether that should be progressed or not. So that was the original idea, and as Phil said, it would have been done under 3 or 4 stages with the least amount of civil engineering works taking place first, seeing how it goes over the next 6 months to a year, and then implementing additional phases if required to further reduce speeds. Then came along the DFT announcement on an emergency active travel fund, which KCC has taken advantage of and put in a bid for 1.6 million for lots of measures around the county, not just Faversham, around the county. And fortunately, KCC were successful in getting the full 1.6 million. There was a phase 2 to that, where an additional 6 million has been put on the table if Kent shows it can implement the first tranche, which includes Faversham, within a very, very tight timescale. So we have 8 weeks to implement the 20 mile per hour using approximately £150,000 worth of the active travel fund. Now that's an extremely tight timescale, and it wasn't something that we were initially prepared for, but Kent, working closely with Swale and Faversham Town Council, grabbed hold of this, and then we've decided to do this. The only way we could implement a 20 so quickly was using an experimental traffic order, which allows the higher authority, in this case is KCC, to advertise that order for 7 days and then implement the order after 7 days with a period of 6 months, maximum period of 6 months, where we gain feedback. And then a decision is made after those 6 months as to whether it remains or it's taken out. But in order to gain feedback and make a recommendation, the there's lots of data that we need to collect first, and I'll come on to that towards the end of my slot. So the KCC decided to do a trial with Faversham in the east of Kent, as well as Tunbridge in West Kent. And we're also using Deal as a neutral town, so we can compare before and after figures and allow a thorough data collection to be made to allow a suitable recommendation to be made. Just making an experimental order, that process is fairly straightforward. What is important is the implementation, just putting down signs and lines alone. As Phil said, it has an effect, but it's not the whole story. And we need to follow this up, or at the same time implement a very strong campaign to support the traffic regulation order, because it's known that we need the local support to bring the speeds down. So a strong campaign has been worked on over the last 4 to 6 weeks and is being implemented as we speak. So I'll come on to the campaign shortly. So the timing of all of this, as I said, is very tight. We need to have it implemented and live by the 18th of September. So we've got 15 days to finish off all of the works that we need to, and that was a date given by the Department for Transport. So we're working really quickly to get all that done, and you will see that the gateways, and those are the coloured surfacing with the 20 roundels and supported by the 20 mph signs, have been implemented. It's also then, we've got the 20 mph repeater signs going on a lot of the street lamps, lighting columns. So we'll see quite a lot of those, and we're also going to support that with some 20 mph roundels painted on the road where we know the speeds are slightly higher. And again, Phil pointed out those roads that we felt needed a little bit more encouragement rather than just signs to reduce speeds. So they will be implemented by the 18th of September. They aren't actually implemented yet. I mentioned about the funding. So we've complete by the 18th of September, and the data that will allow us to make a decision on how successful is made up of some attitudinal and behavioural consultations. So we've done some pre-consultations. We've employed a consultant to go out and ask questions of the community. We'll gather that information. We'll then do another consultation, gathering more information on the attitudes and behaviours as you start experiencing the 20 mph. And on completion, we may well do a further survey to see how behaviours and attitudes have changed. We've also collected data on pedestrian flows, on cycle flows at various points around the town. And we've got the existing crash records going back quite a few years. Again, we'll collect the data on completion of the experimental period, and that will help us all make a decision on whether to continue with the 20 or to alter it or to remove it. So there's various options, and it certainly hasn't been decided yet. The campaign is headed Healthier, Safer, Cleaner. So you'll see those logos being advertised, and there's a significant campaign on Facebook and other media, on other media types. So I think that's probably it from me. Thank you, Eddie.
Lovely, thank you very much, Jamie. Okay, moving on to some questions now. One that seems to crop up quite a bit, one I'm sure all of us have been asked at some point or other, is about the enforcement of the 20 mph speed limit. So the question is the 20 mph speed limit enforceable? And I'm going to ask Amanda to come in first on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I'm the best person to answer this, but I will answer it from a campaigner's perspective, which is that all speed limits are enforceable. But what the approach that we take with with 20 miles an hour is that it's much easier to gain compliance if you have buy-in from the community. So, and there are various ways of doing that. So the first thing that you look at is what Phil Jones is doing, which is this very technical work about all these subtle ways that you signal to drivers, motorists on the street to bring the speed down. And those are tried and tested methods that he can talk in more detail about. But what you also can do is, and this is something that, you know, we're sort of discussing in our meetings at the moment, is that if we can build up a picture where we have persistent offenders who are speeding in persistent places, then we can see where these problems are occurring because we'll have empirical data. And then we can start to make decisions, or the town council actually can start to make decisions about how that is addressed, whether it's addressed through more community awareness and education, whether it needs further physical intervention, whether we need to get a local speed watch group to come out and monitor speeds. So it gives us the data that we need in order to see where this problem is occurring. But in terms of enforcement, a campaigner would always say that you don't conflate enforcing with implementing what is the correct speed limit, where vehicles and human people mix on foot and bike. You set the correct speed limit because it's the correct speed limit to set for that particular street based on how many people are using, you know, cycling and walking, and because you want to create a better balance between motorcycles and vehicles. You don't decide to set it on the basis that, you know, you don't say to yourself, right, we'll never get people to get down to 20, so therefore we won't bother setting it. And what we're seeing across the country is that speed limits are coming down with signage only, and and as Phil has already pointed out, a 1 mile an hour reduction in speed results in a 6% reduction in collisions. So I think, Phil, would you want to say more about that? Or
well, I need to say, of course, a couple of thoughts really. There's probably quite low levels of enforcement now of the 30, you know, so if you say, well, we wouldn't put in a 20 limit because it won't be enforced, then there's almost an argument to say, well, why have a 30 limit, you know? So I think it is about, as you said, Amanda, you know, saying what do we expect people to do, and we know that not everyone will comply 100%, but I think it is about sending the right signals. The other thing I just mention is that what we expect in the next 2 to 4 years, all new cars will have to have, by regulation, starting with the EU, but despite Brexit, the UK government said they'll honour it. All new cars will have to have a speed limit, automatic speed limiter fitted, that you will still be able to override by pressing down on the accelerator, but the car will know what the speed limit is. And it will drive to the speed limit, and when you reach that limit, the engine power will reduce to try to keep you within the speed limit. Now, yes, you can kick down and override it, but you'd have to make a decision to do that, and every time you restart the car, it will come back on. So I think that over time we can expect that gradually the limit will become more effective. So I think, you know, starting and setting that, and whether that's through vehicle technology or peer pressure or people just in the town, you know, voting themselves, because you only need maybe 10 or 15% of people living in Faversham to pledge to drive at the speed limit, to actually act as pace cars to reduce the speed of most people. So there's lots of ways that this will, and enforcement as a kind of, you know, backup from the police with community involvement as well. So I think there's lots of ways that the pressure will start to build to bring speeds down over time, once you've said what the right speed is. So I think we don't have to just look at the police. That's one kind of dimension of it, really.
Lovely, thank you, Phil. I've got a question for Jamie. It's regarding the gateways that have recently been installed. There was a little bit of opinions being shared on the red and the buff, the yellow road surfacing. What are KCC's plans in regarding those gateways and the colours that are being used?
Can you hear me? Sorry, my internet went down there, so I just come in. It's fine. I take it you're talking about the different colours.
That's right. It's what the KCC see as the next step for our ready in regard to the different comments that have been with regard to the buff surface and the red surface. Yeah.
Okay. The thinking behind that is there is a conservation area in Faversham, and the colours came about from having discussions about what was the most appropriate colour for a conservation area. Now it's a bit arbitrary, and I'm sure people will have different opinions on that, but the buff area, although it's quite a yellow buff, was decided for the conservation areas, and the red for outside the conservation areas. And we are getting feedback on the red is quite bright, and the yellow, you can't see the white on the yellow. So that's feedback that we'll take on board. But that's the reason why you see two different colours. And for the roundels, there will just be a plain white marking on the road. There's no colour underneath them for the repeater roundels. It's purely the gateway features that we felt needed to be a lot more in the driver's or all road users' eyesight to see that they were entering something that's new for Faversham and making a bit of a statement.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Can I bring in Councillor Julian Saunders now, who'd like to also reply on that question? Thank you, Julian.
Okay, so thank you, Eddie. I'm not sure I've got a lot to add. I mean, certainly quite a few people have fed back to me that they prefer the red to the yellow, although I gather some people have said that they feel the red is rather too bright. So I think it would be really good if KCC, after a period of time, once we've built up a bit more of the view of what local people feel, can review the colours. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Okay, got another question here about pollution. How will the 20 mile an hour limit affect pollution? There's some arguments on both ways. Some people say it'll make it worse. Some people say it'll make it better. What would you say, Phil?
So I think the evidence on air quality there is some evidence that traffic calming schemes that rely on stringent traffic calming physical measures can make air quality worse locally, because air quality problems with fossil fuel, petrol and diesel cars arises mainly from the acceleration, from harsh acceleration. So if drivers accelerate every time they go over a speed bump and then brake and accelerate again, then that can, and it's been demonstrated, that can cause air quality problems. Speed limits don't work like that. They work more in terms of just this general depression of speeds. And so if speeds can be held to be more neutral, and so there is that harsh acceleration is not present, then those problems shouldn't arise. But my understanding of that is that that hasn't been studied quite so extensively to be quite clear one way or the other in terms of the impact. Having said that, obviously over the next 10, 20 years, we are the country we're moving to emission-free vehicles or low-emission vehicles anyway. So that whole issue of air quality is likely to become less important over time in any event.
Lovely, yeah, thank you for that, Phil. Amanda, do pedestrians take less care in a 20 mile an hour limit area?
Well, I think I would say from the evidence that we've gathered from the community, people do or don't take care depending on how at risk they feel they are. So when we did the exercise in the Market Square, people's perceptions of where they were unsafe were based on what the traffic was doing rather than what the speed limit was. And whether the traffic was likely to stop at a crossing, as to what, you know, not whether there was a crossing there or not. So I think that it's, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence to suggest that people take less care where there's a lower speed limit, and if anything, it's more likely to get people to go out and cycle, but if they're doing that and they're mixing more with traffic, then there's a greater balance, I think, between cyclists, pedestrians and motorists. So everybody sort of becomes more aware of each other in a very different way, and it changes the relationship altogether, as opposed to where you have a speed limit that everybody's become very complacent about. You know, you've got motorists who can just sort of not be aware that they're sharing the road quite as frequently. And I think we all saw that in lockdown, where suddenly people were venturing out onto the streets. They felt galvanised to get out on their bikes and their cyclists and walking on the country lanes. And suddenly motorists very quickly adapted to having people on their streets, and there were fewer of them. But because they could see that people had a right to be there and that they needed to be there, it just changed that dynamic. So I think it's actually just more interesting to look at how it will affect motorist behaviour, really, than pedestrians. But perhaps Phil wants to say some more about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's so. The kind of philosophy here is road danger reduction. So you can achieve safety, if you like, or an absence of collisions and an absence of casualties by fencing off roads, by stopping children going out. You can kind of remove the vulnerable person from the equation, and that's one way of reducing casualties. But a better way is to reduce the danger at source, and that's effectively what reducing speeds is. It's because the energy, any moving body has its energy is based on the square of the speed. So, which is another explanation for why quite small percentage reductions have a big effect. So it's all about reducing danger, and yeah, it has been postulated that suddenly pedestrians will start to behave in odd ways, or ways that doesn't look after their own safety, but there's no evidence of that. I don't think there's any evidence of that. And as Amanda said, the evidence, say, in terms of, particularly pronounced in terms of cycling, where cycling levels have increased, the likelihood of a cyclist being injured goes down, and it's what's called the safety in numbers effect. So that the presence of more people on bikes on roads does begin to change driver perception, driver behaviour, reduces their speeds, make them more aware of them. And so that's the kind of positive way that we want to reduce collisions is by encouraging more people to be out walking, and you achieve that by reducing the danger and the perception of danger, rather than thinking that that's going to lead them to behave in a sort of reckless way.
Oh, thank you, Phil. Jamie, are there any plans for more traffic calming on all road and lower roads?
We're going to assess how the experiment first 6 months takes place, and if we feel that the speeds are still too high for those slightly faster roads, then we will look to see whether further measures are required to bring the speeds down some. So I suppose the quick answer is it's watch this space. But certainly our intention at the moment is to do as little engineering as possible to bring speeds down. But if there is a need, then we will be looking at that over the coming 6 months, year, 2 years.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Okay. Phil, I've seen some reports, or people have noticed reports, i.e. there was a report from the Bath and North Somerset 20 mile an hour schemes, and I think you might have touched on it a bit earlier, and that report suggested that the 20 mile an hour scheme there led to more casualties. How would you respond to that? I'm
not familiar with the precise details of that of that study, but I think from my recollection, I think it was very, very partial and really just focused on a relatively small number of streets. The more representative studies that I've seen from places like Bristol that have done area-wide studies, and Edinburgh and Cardiff and other cities, is that there have been these quite significant reductions in casualties. So I think it is quite exceptional. It is really a kind of statistical quirk for that particular scheme, is my understanding of it, and is not really held up as a representative study. So certainly the academics that I've been working doing some work recently for the Welsh government, looking at a change nationally to where they would actually change the way the orders are required. So in Wales, if this goes through, you would have to make an order to make the speed limit 30 rather than to reduce it to 20, which is interesting. And certainly in the academic literature review that was done by other people that led into that study, the Bath study didn't feature, and it was considered that the Bristol-based work and Edinburgh-based was more reliable, more representative.
Lovely, thank you, Phil. I've had a question emailed in, and it's about rat runs. There's one or two roads around town that have been used as rat runs for quite a while, and I think the residents are keen to know what is the right way of tackling this, and how can we slow down the traffic in these rat run streets? What is the best solution for that?
I mean, I perhaps there are two ways of dealing with that, and rat run is a bit of an imprecise term sometimes. I always wonder, how far do you have to be driving through an area to be considered as through traffic? You know, it's always a slightly woolly issue, but I guess people are concerned about the speed and volume of traffic, and is it the speed, is it the volume? Through the 20-mile-an-hour scheme, and potentially later some physical calming, if that's felt to be necessary, you can deal with the speed problem. If the volume of traffic is still considered to be too high, then many authorities are now looking at implementing point closures, or sometimes called filters, traffic filters, so that you put in some kind of blockage which people on foot and cycle can, and maybe even public transport, can go through, but cars can't, and therefore you would actually reduce the volume of traffic as well. That's not part of the current proposals for Faversham, but it would be a possibility, and the government has talked favourably about that kind of approach, and made so some of the emergency COVID money, they've indicated that they would prefer to see schemes that had that kind of filtering approach to reduce the volume of through traffic. So that could be something that Faversham might consider at some point in the future, but it's not been part of the current proposals.
Thank you, Phil. Often people ask about speed bumps. Are they a good solution to that sort of thing? To slowing traffic down? I mean, they're very, well, I mean, Jamie wants to come as well, but I mean, speed bumps are very effective. There's no question about it. You know, you can really slow people down with speed bumps, but they do come with some negatives as well, which we've talked about air pollution, and there can be noise issues, and they can be very unpopular. So they work, but I guess, you know, they're quite a crude method.
Yeah, I can come in there as well. There are plenty of examples around Kent where the speed cushions or speed humps are being put in, but we try not to put them in nearly as much as we have done in the past, because of exactly as Phil said, the noise particularly is an issue in a residential area. Lorries going through, empty lorries particularly, cause lots of vibration. So they really are not a popular form of traffic calming, and we try not to put those in where we don't need to, but they are effective. Likewise, if we put in horizontal build outs, things like that, they have an issue themselves. So it is really difficult to try and engineer out, you know, to reduce traffic flows and speeds without causing other problems.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
Eddie, you've got a question, a related comment, stroke question about rat run streets and emergency service shortcuts. I don't know if the panel could comment on that.
Thank you, Julian. Yeah, with regard to emergency services, do 20 mile an hour limits delay emergency services getting to the locations? Who feels as though they can answer that?
Well, probably I've been talking to the local fire brigade, and they are actually more concerned with, particularly where they've got part-time staff getting to the fire station rather than the fire tenders getting to wherever they've got to get to. So that a bit for us is learning on whether the staff can get there as quickly as they need to. But the fire brigade haven't brought up any issues about getting to the destination slower by having a 20 mile per hour.
And I think the standard exemptions, so emergency vehicles are exempt from limits, aren't they, generally, I think? So they couldn't sort of receive a ticket, if you like, for exceeding the 20.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
I think and then the question was sort of talking about point closures as well, the so-called filtering. I mean, that can be an issue. There are ways around it. Some of the bollards that are used to close off are actually a fire truck. They're deformable. You know, so a fire truck can drive over them slowly, and to a car driver, it looks like you couldn't, but they can be overridden in an emergency, so, or a lockable bollard. So there are ways around it, but clearly that is an issue that would have to be thought about very carefully and consulted with the emergency services.
Okay, thank you all very much for that, and thank you for participating. We've covered all the questions that were brought up and some others that were sent in to us. So thank you all, and thank you everyone online for attending. And I'm going to close the webinar now. But thank you all very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.